If you can pay for the lowest room, I'll give you the suite. The manager laughed, certain he'd humiliate the simple man. But that day, the rancher shut everyone up. The sun was already setting when Robert stepped through the glass entrance of the Grand Palace, a luxury hotel known for its white marble columns, red carpets, and a reception colder than the central air conditioning. He walked in slowly, like a man treading on foreign ground. He wore faded jeans, a checkered button-down shirt, dusty boots, and a wide straw hat with worn-out brims. He carried only a dark leather suitcase, scarred by time. The receptionist, Emily, who was typing something on the computer, looked up and smiled kindly. She was a young woman with a firm posture and attentive eyes. "Good evening, sir. How may I help you?" Robert politely removed his hat and spoke in a low, drawn-out voice. "I'd like a room for a few days. Doesn't have to be fancy. All I need is a bed, a bathroom, and some peace." Before Emily could respond, a man shot out from the back of the counter like an arrow. Perfectly tailored suit, slicked back hair, and a smile dripping with venom. "Emily, darling, let me handle this one," said Manager Richard, never taking his eyes off Robert, as if he were inspecting an animal outside the fence. "Of course, Mr. Richard," Emily replied, hesitant. Richard leaned his elbows on the counter, bringing his face closer to Robert's on purpose. His eyes were cold and calculating. "Are you sure you're in the right place? This is the Grand Palace, not some roadside motel. The cheapest rate is 800 Rs. Robert didn't flinch. He simply set his suitcase on the floor and wiped the sweat from his forehead with a handkerchief. "I know where I'm standing. I want a room. I've got the money." "Uh-huh," Richard sneered. "Look, I'll be honest. We don't usually accept guests who show up like this." He gestured up and down with his fingers. "But you know what? Let's make it fun. If you have 800 Rs in cash, right here and now, you get the presidential suite. Fair deal, isn't it?" The lobby went silent. Two couples waiting to check in watched with barely concealed curiosity. Emily, embarrassed, lowered her eyes. "Cash okay?" Robert asked, half smiling. "If you pull it out right now and pay up front, I'll keep my word," Richard replied, crossing his arms, certain the country bumpkin didn't have 100 Rs to his name. Robert reached into the inside pocket of his shirt and pulled out a thick roll of bills held together by an old rubber band. He began counting slowly, note by note, in front of everyone. 200, 400, 600, 800. He calmly pushed the stack across the counter. The silence turned to shock. Richard took a few seconds to react. He swallowed hard, as if trying not to choke on his own pride. "All right, then. Well, a deal's a deal. Emily, prepare the presidential suite for Mr. Robert Carter." Emily nodded, still stunned, and went to get the key card. As she printed the paperwork, she glanced at the manager, who was now wiping his forehead with a pocket handkerchief, visibly shaken. Robert signed the form with a steady hand and took the key. "Which way does the suite face?" he asked, holding his hat under his arm. "It overlooks the financial district," Emily replied. "It's the best view in the hotel." "Good. I like to see where the money flows, and where it runs away, too." Emily stifled a laugh, while Richard forced a smile. As Robert bent down to grab his suitcase, one of the couples whispered, "Who would have thought?" Emily stepped out from behind the counter to walk him to the elevator. As they crossed the brightly lit lobby, Robert looked around carefully. "Beautiful place, luxurious. But I can see some things never made it off the blueprint," he said, pointing at a wall with thin cracks and a dead digital sign. "Do you work in construction?" Emily asked, intrigued. "A little. Built plenty with my own hands. And when you build with your own sweat, you learn to notice what others pretend not to see." They reached the elevator. Emily pressed the button for the 18th floor. The cabin's mirror reflected the two of them, she in a spotless uniform, He in simple clothes but standing tall. Emily no longer saw him as a man out of place. There was something about him, an observant gaze, a quiet confidence, that made appearances irrelevant. "Mr. Robert, I'm sorry about what happened downstairs. Not everyone here thinks like the manager." He smiled without resentment. "Don't worry, miss. Sometimes it takes a hat out of place to see who's who." The elevator doors opened on the top floor. The suite was ready, huge, luxurious, with a living room, a balcony, and even a jacuzzi overlooking the city. Emily handed him the key with respect. "Anything you need, just call the front desk." "Much obliged. And tell the manager the game's just getting started." Emily nodded, not quite sure what he meant, but she already felt it. This man was anything but ordinary. The presidential suite felt like a world of its own. A thick carpet, a king-size bed with Egyptian cotton sheets, leather armchairs, a crystal chandelier. Robert placed his suitcase on a side table and walked over to the balcony. He gazed down at the city the way a farmer studies his crops, in silence, watchful, as if calculating the true value of the landscape before his eyes. He took off his hat, set it on the sofa, and turned on the television, more out of habit than genuine interest. His body was weary from the road, but his eyes remained sharp. He wasn't the kind of man to be impressed by marble floors. Meanwhile, in the hotel restaurant downstairs, whispers traveled quickly from table to table. "Did you see the guy with the hat? They say he's in the presidential suite. He walked in with an old suitcase. Is this some kind of joke?" The manager turned pale when he pulled out the cash. "Can you believe it?" The buzz spread like wildfire through dry grass. Richard, seated at a table near the bar, tried to feign indifference, but his clenched jaw and fingers drumming furiously on his glass gave him away. The public humiliation stuck in his throat like a bone. He pulled his phone from his pocket and dialed the front desk. "Emily, it's Richard. I need you to get that man out of the suite. Now." "Excuse me, sir?" "Make up an excuse. A leak? Maintenance? Anything. He can't stay there. It's ridiculous." Emily took a deep breath, keeping her voice steady. "With all due respect, Mr. Richard, he paid the rate and you promised the suite. There's no legitimate reason to remove him." "Then invent one," he shouted. "He doesn't belong here. He's ruining the hotel's image." "The image of the hotel is measured by how we treat our guests," Emily said before hanging up, leaving silence as her answer. Richard slammed his napkin onto the table and huffed. He had lost control of the story and it drove him mad. At that very moment, Robert came down for dinner. He had changed his shirt but still wore his boots and hat. He walked into the restaurant with his usual calm, ignoring the stares. He chose a table in the corner, away from the spotlight, and ordered a simple meal: rice, beans, steak, and salad. The waiter hesitated. A few minutes later, another waiter, the most experienced one, with a forced smile and sharp eyes, approached. Richard had given him a discreet mission: to test the country bumpkin's limits. "Good evening, sir. Would you like a glass of our house wine? Or perhaps some artisanal cachaça?" Robert smiled without rushing. "Do you have fresh brewed coffee?" "With all due respect, sir, this is a 5-star restaurant." "Then it ought to have fresh brewed coffee too. But you can bring the wine. Who knows, maybe it'll go well with beans." The waiter stepped back awkwardly. Robert's subtle irony disarmed any provocation. As he ate, some guests tried to steal glances. His posture wasn't that of a man out of place. It was of someone who knew exactly where he was, someone who didn't need to prove anything to anyone. From behind the counter, Emily watched. Robert's composure stood in stark contrast to the tense atmosphere around him. Something didn't add up. And that name? It sounded familiar. When she had a spare moment, she discreetly typed Robert Carter into the reception computer. A few clicks later, a magazine article appeared on the screen. Robert Carter, one of the largest cattle ranchers in the Midwest, leads multi-million-dollar auctions and is a reference in sustainable land management. Owner of over 20,000 hectares of land, social projects, and award-winning Nelore cattle. Emily read it twice, stunned. There was an old photo of Robert standing beside two smiling businessmen, hat in hand, looking exactly as she had seen him that afternoon. The same gaze, the same calm. She turned her eyes back to the dining room and saw him finishing his meal. He stood, gave the waiter a polite nod, and walked calmly toward the elevator. Emily swallowed hard. Later, near the end of her shift, she decided to take a courtesy gift from the hotel up to the suite. A gesture that might seem ordinary, but at that moment meant respect and an attempt to approach that walking enigma. She knocked on the door. After a few seconds, Robert opened it with his usual calm expression, now wearing a light cotton shirt. "Good evening, miss." "Good evening, Mr. Robert. I brought you a glass of wine. Compliments of the house." "Well now, thank you. Please come on in." She stepped inside discreetly. The suite was quiet, but a folder lay open on the table with documents, numbers, and maps. From the back room, a speakerphone conversation could be heard, and that's when Emily froze, tray still in her hands. "Tell George and Daniel I'll be at the auction." "Yes," Robert was saying firmly. "We're closing the Nelore lot. Everything's already lined up with the accountant." Emily didn't move. She just listened. The truth was beginning to sink in, along with the collapse of Richard's prejudice-driven charade. That man wasn't some hillbilly lost in a luxury hotel. He was someone running the game. Richard arrived early at the lobby that morning, more out of anxiety than duty. He wore his best suit, fixed his hair in the reflection of the elevator mirror, and took his place behind the counter as if nothing had happened the night before. To him, the theater with Robert had to be forgotten. Just another social misstep. Nothing that a good dose of arrogance and control couldn't fix. Emily arrived minutes later, her steps firm, greeting him with a discreet good morning. There was something in her eyes, a mix of respect and defiance, that unsettled Richard more than he cared to admit. "Any news?" he asked, flipping through the reservation book. "Just a scheduled visit this morning. 2 agribusiness entrepreneurs, if I'm not mistaken," Emily replied. "They said they're here to meet an important guest." Richard scoffed. "Hopefully these at least bring a black card. I'm tired of dirty boot farmers trying to throw their weight around." But the sarcastic laugh died on his lips the moment the hotel's revolving doors opened. 2 well-dressed men walked in, sunglasses on, posture upright. One of them, gray-haired with a neatly trimmed beard, carried a fine leather briefcase. The other, younger, in a light blue dress shirt and casual blazer, wore the confident smile of someone used to being in charge. "Good morning," the older man said, removing his sunglasses. "We've come to meet Robert Carter. He's staying here, correct?" Emily stepped forward. "Yes, sir. He's in the presidential suite. Shall I announce your arrival?" "Presidential suite?" interrupted the younger one, Daniel, with a pleased smile. "At last the old Grand Palace is living up to its name." "About time." Richard turned pale. "Forgive me. And you gentlemen are?" "George Cooper, and this is my son, Daniel. We've worked with Robert for over 20 years, the older man said, shaking Emily's hand firmly. "We're longtime partners." The tone was calm, but every word landed like a punch to Richard's ego. He knew those names. George Cooper was one of the most respected investors in agribusiness. Richard had read about him in business magazines. And now here they were, praising Robert like he was a star in the industry. I had no idea he was so influential," Richard muttered, almost to himself. "He never bothers to say," Daniel added with a grin, "but he's always the most important man in the room. And almost never the best dressed." George turned to Emily. "Can you let him know we're here? If he's busy, we'll wait in the restaurant." "Of course, Mr. George. I'll head up right away." Richard, desperate to salvage some control, forced a smile. "Would you gentlemen like something while you wait? Coffee, perhaps?" George shot him a glance. "If it's like the kind Robert serves on the ranch, I'll take it, but I doubt you've got that here." Richard swallowed hard for the second time that week. While Emily went upstairs, Robert was already expecting them. He had changed into a sharper shirt but still wore his boots, carrying the same simple demeanor. "George is here, right?" he asked before Emily could say a word. "Yes, sir. They're in the restaurant." "Good. I brought the paperwork so we can go over everything calmly." In the hotel cafe, the three men sat together at a more private table. Emily, attentive, kept a respectful distance, though close enough to catch parts of the conversation. "Budget's closed. $12 million just for the first stage of the auction," Robert said, sliding the folder to George. "And the genetics project?" Daniel asked, flipping through the papers. "It's in there too." "Oh, and I included the hotel improvements. That construction contract has been stalled for too long." George frowned. "Stalled? Why?" "Because some people would rather save on appearances than invest in what upholds the name," Robert replied, glancing sideways at the reception desk. Emily pretended not to hear, but her mind was already connecting the dots. When the trio stood to leave, Robert left a smaller brown folder beside his chair. Emily hurried to grab it. "Mr. Robert, you forgot this!" "Ah, thank you, miss. Good thing you're always paying attention." He smiled and turned back to George. But at the counter, as Emily was about to return the documents, a sheet slipped to the floor. She bent to pick it up and froze when she read the header. Property deed. Grand Palace Hotel owner, Robert Carter. The blood drained from her face. For a moment, the entire hotel seemed to stop around her. Robert wasn't just an influential rancher. He was the owner of the place. Emily spent the rest of the morning torn between shock and urgency. The document she had found left no room for doubt. Robert was the owner of the Grand Palace. Not an investor, not a special guest, the owner. The simple man in dusty boots and a soft voice commanded everything without ever raising his tone. In the early afternoon, she asked to speak with him privately. They met in a side corridor near the service entrance. "Mr. Robert, forgive me for being so bold, but that document you dropped, is it real?" Robert crossed his arms, leaning casually against the wall. "It is, miss. I bought this hotel 3 years ago." Emily blinked, astonished. "Why didn't you ever say anything?" "Because those who talk too much don't listen enough. And I came here to listen. I wanted to see how things were running, away from uniforms, away from titles. The truth shows itself when people don't think they're being watched." She nodded, taking in every word. He then smiled with a spark in his eyes. "I was just waiting for the right moment." That very afternoon, Robert requested that management gather the entire staff in the hotel's event auditorium. The request was met with surprise. No guest had ever done such a thing. But since it came with direct authorization from the system, and curiously from the owner himself, no one dared refuse. At 5 p.m., sharp, waiters, receptionists, housekeepers, maintenance staff, and management were assembled. Richard entered last, his face tense. He tried to make sense of what was happening, still clinging to the idea that he controlled the narrative. Robert walked in without fuss, wearing the same simple clothes as always. The chatter died instantly. "Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. My name is Robert Carter. Some of you know me only as the man in the presidential suite. Others saw me as the hillbilly with the hat, but today I'm here to speak as the owner of this hotel." A murmur swept through the room. Richard turned pale. "I've owned the Grand Palace since 2022. I bought this place as part of expanding my businesses, but I always made a point of leaving the management independent. I don't like the spotlight. I prefer trust, but trust has its limits. He paused briefly, letting his eyes move across the faces before him. These past few days, I've been here as any guest, and I saw a lot. I saw respect from those earning the least, and arrogance from those meant to set the example. I saw people working hard in silence, and I also saw falsified reports, inflated expenses, and phantom suppliers, he said, his tone firming. There's even a company under the name of a manager's relative, all with receipts, all documented. Richard shot up, his face red with anger. You can't accuse me like this. I'm not accusing. I'm presenting facts. I've got documents. I've got statements. I've got names. If you want, I can read them one by one, Robert replied, pulling a slim folder from his bag. The silence was funereal. Richard sank back into his chair, defeated. But worse than the numbers is the spirit that's taken hold here, a spirit of contempt, a way of treating people as disposable, inferior, invisible. That isn't luxury. That's rot, dressed up as status. Robert walked slowly down the aisle between the chairs, like a man crossing land he knew well. When I first arrived, Emily treated me with respect, without knowing who I was. She didn't ask if I had a credit card, a suit, or an expensive watch. She just did her job with dignity. That's worth more than any diploma. Emily blushed as her colleagues looked at her with admiration. Robert went on. And so, Emily, I want to thank you publicly. You were the one face of the Grand Palace that reflected what this hotel should stand for. Service with dignity, without flattery, without judgment. Congratulations. The staff applauded. Emily, visibly moved, nodded in gratitude. Then Robert stopped in front of Richard. Now, let's talk about you. Richard tried to hold his composure. If you're suggesting that my management has been... I'm not suggesting anything, Richard. I'm stating it. You manipulated numbers, created barriers to block audits, and treated clients as nuisances when they didn't fit your personal standards. All this while being well paid to do exactly the opposite. The tension was palpable. Everyone awaited the obvious, the dismissal. Robert stared at the manager for a few seconds. Then he took a deep breath, and the unexpected happened. But I'm not going to fire you. The room buzzed with shocked whispers. I'm going to make you an offer. Richard frowned, confused. You're going to spend the next 6 months working with me. On the ranch, waking up before dawn, cleaning corrals, helping with the cattle, eating with the ranch hands. No management title, no air conditioning. Just you, your humility, if you still have any, and the chance to relearn what it means to serve. The silence that followed wasn't doubt. It was impact. Robert turned to the staff and concluded, leadership isn't what we impose, it's what we inspire, and there is no leadership without respect. The meeting was over, and everyone in that room knew that from that day on, the Grand Palace would never be the same. The meeting room emptied slowly, but the feeling in the air was one of renewal, as if someone had opened all the windows of the hotel and let the stale air escape. Only 3 people remained: Robert, Richard, and Emily. Richard sat motionless, staring at the floor as if the marble might offer him an answer. His fitted suit, expensive tie, and meticulously styled hair, all of it now looked like useless armor. Robert broke the silence. Look, I could fire you. I've got plenty of reason. But firing doesn't teach character. It only relieves the problem. What you need is a lesson. Richard lifted his gaze, his eyes burning with wounded pride. And you think you'll re-educate me by sending me to a farm? Not just any farm, mine. Out there, nobody's better than anyone else. No name tags with titles, no glass-walled offices, everyone works. And anyone who thinks they're too important learns to be useful first. I'm a manager, Mr. Robert, not a farmhand. That's exactly the problem. Richard went silent. It'll be 6 months. You'll sleep in the bunkhouse. Wake up with the bell. Work with the crew. And if you finish that time with dignity, you can come back. Maybe even come back better. The manager hesitated. He glanced at Emily, who kept her eyes lowered, avoiding judgment. The silence of shame weighed heavier than 1,000 shouts. "Fine," he muttered. "I accept." Robert nodded. "Good. It'll be hard, but fair." Then he turned to Emily. "Now, we've got another matter." She raised her eyes. "Starting today, you're the interim manager of the Grand Palace?" Emily's eyes widened. "Mr. Robert, I don't even know where to start." "Start the same way you started with me, with respect, honesty, and firmness. The rest, we'll train." Richard looked like he wanted to protest, but stopped. He knew he no longer had a voice there. "I'll also allocate part of the auction's budget to train the whole staff. Service, hospitality, professional ethics. We're going to rebuild this place from the inside out." Emily took a deep breath, feeling the weight and the honor of that moment. It was as if, after years of enduring quietly, someone had finally seen her. Later that day, the rumors spread like wildfire. The manager would be sent to a farm. Emily would take over. And the mysterious owner of the hotel was, in fact, the man with the hat everyone had seen in the lobby. But there was no chaos, only curiosity and hope. Emily called a small staff meeting, now as manager. No arrogance, no show of authority, just clarity. "I know many of you have worked here in fear or without motivation. I know the culture here has been rotten," she said plainly. "But that ends now. And not because of me, because of us. Everyone here has value, and whoever doesn't understand that doesn't belong here." One by one, the staff began to loosen their shoulders. For the first time, the word work no longer seemed to carry only weight. There was a spark in their eyes. At the reception, Emily replaced the old bulletin board. Instead of impersonal rules, she posted a single handwritten phrase. "Treat every person as if they were the owner of the place. Because one day, they just might be." By late afternoon, Robert appeared in the lobby carrying a cardboard box in his hands. Calm, as always. Staff hurried to greet him now with genuine respect. Outside, a car with a driver was already waiting. Richard appeared in the hall carrying a small suitcase, his blazer slung over his arm, his face worn. But there was, hidden deep down, a spark of acceptance. Robert extended the box. "Here's your uniform. Work boots, a cotton shirt, and a hat. Not designer, but it'll protect you from the sun. And maybe help you see more clearly." Richard took the box without a word. Before leaving, he turned and cast one last look at the hotel. There were no applause, no sarcasm, just silence and humility. Emily watched from behind the counter. When their eyes met, she only nodded, without resentment, without irony, just acknowledgement. Robert crossed his arms and smiled, satisfied. "Now you're ready to begin." The sky was still dark when the farm bell rang, just as it did every morning. The sound echoed across the dew-soaked fields, waking men and beasts with the same discipline. In the bunkhouse, among muddy boots and creaking bunks, an alarm clock buzzed. Richard opened his eyes, slowly. 6 a.m. Again. He got out of bed, washed his face in the cold water of the communal sink, put on the cotton shirt of his uniform, grabbed the straw hat Robert had given him, and walked toward the corral. It was the 5th month. 5 months of rising with the sun, feeding cattle, fixing fences, digging holes, learning to listen. 5 months of eating with ranch hands, sharing sweat and dust with men and women who had never worn a suit in their lives and never needed to. In the first days, Richard walked stiffly, trying to keep his distance. He still clung to the remnants of pride that had once dressed him better than any blazer. But the land stripped those layers away. Day after day, the heat, the rain, the weight on his shoulders, and the simple conversations peeled off what was left of his vanity. And before he knew it, he was calling the oxen by name, laughing at jokes in the dining hall, getting his hands dirty without complaint. Not out of obligation, but because he had learned that real work carries dignity, whether in a corral or in a glass office. On the other side of the story, at the Grand Palace, Emily walked through halls now brighter, not only from structural renovations, but also from the new spirit of the staff. The old broken sign had been replaced with a modern installation made from recycled construction material, a project she herself had proposed. Where the old panel of rules had once hung, now there was a single phrase engraved in brushed metal at the reception desk: "Respect is not a luxury, it's the minimum." Emily Johnson, manager. She implemented small but powerful changes: weekly team meetings, an anonymous suggestion box, training focused on empathy and hospitality. She created a program to train at-risk youth for careers in hospitality. And most importantly, she listened. The results were immediate. The hotel began to attract new clients, especially agribusiness entrepreneurs, who were inspired by the story of the hotel's transformation. The Grand Palace became more than a luxury hotel. It became an example of leadership with soul. One morning, Dr. George appeared with a group of investors. "Emily, what you've done here deserves an award. And you did it quietly, the way the great ones do," he praised, shaking her hand with respect. She smiled, without vanity. She knew the credit belonged to the whole team. Meanwhile, on the ranch, Richard's final day had come. "You've learned to care," Robert said, watching him load hay into the barn. "Now there's just one thing left: learning how to come back." Richard didn't answer right away. He only nodded. 2 weeks later, the Grand Palace was calm on a late afternoon when a taxi pulled up at the front entrance. The man who stepped out wasn't wearing a suit. He wore dark jeans, a simple shirt, and in his hands, a worn-out hat. Richard entered quietly. The same lobby he once dominated with his voice now seemed larger, not in size, but in meaning. He walked to the reception desk. Emily looked up, surprised. "Richard?" He removed his hat and stepped closer. "Emily, good to see you. The place looks different, more alive." "And so do you," she replied with a smile that mixed surprise and respect. "I came to say thank you. To you and to Mr. Robert, for everything." She nodded, still taken aback. "Have you come back to reclaim the manager's position?" He shook his head. "No, that wouldn't be fair. I want to start again. From the very beginning, if there's an opening at the front desk, to learn how you all treat people here, it would be an honor." Emily took a moment before responding. Not out of doubt, but out of emotion. There's always room for those who want to do it right. Behind them, a familiar voice spoke. "Now you've got it, Richard." Robert appeared, hands in his pockets, smiling with his eyes. "Now you understand what it means to serve." Richard extended his hand. "And I hope to have the chance to prove it. With time, with work." Robert shook his hand firmly. "Time and work are never in short supply around here." Outside, the sun was beginning to set. The city carried on at its usual pace, but inside the Grand Palace something greater had been built. Not luxury, not facade, roots. And roots, when strong, can weather any storm. And you? What's the most powerful lesson Robert left with you? Share it in the comments. If this message touched you, hit the like button and subscribe. It's a simple way to help this root grow even stronger.